When it comes to survival information, I put this stuff out there so that people can find a way to make it through some of these events and to chalk up some kind of plan in the meantime while you can, to be able to look into the future and say, hey, I may face or encounter a lights out situation, an earthquake because I live in an earthquake prone area, or a tsunami if you're on the coastline, flooding if you're in a floodplain. These are things to think about. When it comes to the Pacific Northwest, there's not a whole lot of talk about the potential for the catastrophe that could strike up in this region. But there really is a very high likelihood that a big time disaster can happen right up in this region. The Cascadia, Juan Fuca connected to this, Washington, Upper Oregon, and this is what they label FEMA Region X. From Idaho, these two states, and Alaska. And of course, Canada would have to deal with whatever they got going on emergency-wise along their coast as well. A tsunami generated by this would extend down into California into a whole nother FEMA region. But in terms of this region, we have the guy in charge of this whole area, FEMA Region X, basically saying that when something happens here, everything west of the I-5 is gone. He goes on to state that Seattle is built on landfill. Now, I want some of you out there to take some time, and I want you to look into the city of where you're living and the ground underneath of you. Because Seattle is just that. And they state that when this 8.8 to 9.2 quake strikes the region, which they say it will, not if, but it will at one point, it will liquefy the ground. It will liquefy it, causing many buildings to just sink right into it. And a lot of the buildings in Seattle are designed for when an earthquake hits, the windows will pop out. This guy goes on to state that there's going to be a lot of glass and debris in the city. We have an expert here that gives his thoughts on this whole thing in connection to this, and he says they believe there's going to be 3 feet of glass in the city. You're not going to see The Rock and everyone else coming on rescue missions trying to save people because you just simply will not be able to get through the city. Then a wall of water is expected to come through. And for those that don't know, they state that the Cascadia can generate an earthquake up to 30 times more powerful than the San Andreas. Of course, they've got a movie on the San Andreas, and of course, the San Andreas can do a lot of damage. But the fact is, they're not paying attention to the one that can do more damage, wipe out multiple states, and unlike the San Andreas, the Cascadia, they say, can form a tsunami because the San Andreas, the way that it moves going the direction that it does, would not generate a tsunami. This is what they state in this information. Now, I would think that if it hit close enough to the coast, there was still some potential, but I guess the way that the plate moves in the area, they're saying the big issue is going to be the Cascadia here. In that Tacoma, everything west of I-5 is going to be gone in a situation like this. And it's pretty crazy to think that we have a city out there in a position like this, a massive tech hub on the West Coast like Seattle, that could literally just sink into the water if a big enough quake came along. I mean, it would be on a scale of which we've never seen. Of course, there could be earthquakes wherever, but there's known fault lines over here. This is also on the Ring of Fire. This is also in the neck of the woods of one of the deadliest labeled volcanoes in America, which is Mount Rainier. They say that if it blows, it could just dwarf what Mount St. Helens did. And this is another crazy part about it. This is why I do these videos. You need to stop and look where you're at, because 150,000 plus people are now living on the old mud flows of the last eruption that took place in terms of this volcano. 150,000 people are just sitting there in the path waiting for the day. What do you think is going to happen when the day comes if it takes the same path? They're all going to get wiped out almost in an instant. This is something that I would like to label like the common sense factor here. Do not live in a floodplain. Do not live at the base of a volcano in the volcanic pyroclastic flow path. You know, the old ventilation tubes or anything like that that you've seen any kind of activity. Be far away from. If you're going to be on a coastline, I would not be sitting there at sea level. I would be up on a mountainside or up at an extended elevation, and I would have a plan. Now, it may be some time before this ever happens. Maybe 100 years. It may be sooner than later. I just already know that when it does happen, it's going to be so catastrophic that it'll probably cripple this country. You lose a city, multiple cities, in an event like that, there wouldn't be no one to go to war with or anything like that. It would be just a straight up disaster. And people would be crippled into submission in this whole region. So, you know, there's very few places out here that offer all that type of destruction. You don't have that on the East Coast. You don't have the fault lines and the earthquakes and the tsunami threats all the way down through here. The Gulf Coast, East Coast, you really don't have that. You have your odd quakes, yes. And of course, the New Madrid could let rip at any time as well. But in terms of extensive earthquake activity, you can see right here that the place that's always swarming is the West Coast. And the Ring of Fire on the West Coast is also where all the volcanic activity is. So if there's going to be anywhere that sees a natural disaster, in my opinion, that is at the highest end of the scale, it's going to be the West Coast. It's going to be somewhere out here. We've got super volcanoes, and massive fault lines that run through here and intersect in different regions as well. Like I said, the Juan de Fuca plate that runs down through here has always been one that's caught my attention. And this region is always quiet. In terms of quake activity, these are things I watch because the longer they go without having any smaller quakes, it's just more energy building up, waiting to release something massive. Zoom in here real quick. You can see Portland would be devastated in this. Olympia would be devastated. Seattle, obviously devastated. This whole area. It's hard to think that water could come in and inundate a lot of this area, but it could. And if you don't know, once again, in here, this most recent quake is right here near Seattle. This whole place built on landfill. That's how they put it. The majority of the city is sitting like that. Never been to Seattle? Don't know if I ever will be, if I ever make it out there. But I do truly believe at some point in time, Seattle will be one of the first cities to go in this country in terms of natural disaster and everything else. You could see Vancouver Island would be affected. Vancouver would be affected there. Now, Vancouver, not built up on fake land like Seattle. So things to keep in mind. Like I always say, you live in an area where there's fault lines, activity like this, you want to know the geology around you. And I'll constantly be updating with more tips and information in terms of survival. In dealing with an event like this, we're going to be, as the weather starts warming up, doing a lot of things in terms of survival and doing things with groups of people, getting people ready for emergency situations. Because if we do not plan for it, well, you're just never going to have a plan at all, and you're never going to be prepared. You got to take that first step and get a plan in motion. This isn't about fear-mongering. This isn't about scaring anybody whatsoever. What's scary is not having a plan. For real. So it's all about awareness and helping one another. But I'll leave links below. Make sure to follow me on Twitter for more, and also join us for Underground World News Live every Friday night, 8 p.m. Eastern on Dabu 77. Hope to see you guys there.